high-performing companies across
a minute on Pienaar and Friends. Well, so much to talk about at Westminster, and we're going to be dripping across the Atlantic for the latest in America too, as we are generally want to do. And on both sides, there's a huge amount to talk about. Stay with us on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
It's just after 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends. Tonight, that's Henry Hill from Conservative Home and Mikey Smith from The Mirror. We have got a lot to talk about, and hopefully you will join in. Send me a text, send me a tweet. Let's all chat after the news with Andy Hayes.
Thank you, John. Good evening. The Chancellor's spokesperson says Rachel Reeves was upset over a personal matter when she was seen crying during Prime Minister's questions. The Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, is said to have pulled her aside before PMQs, after which she was reportedly in tears. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, focused on the massive climb down on the government's welfare bill last night. She claims the Chancellor is in danger now of losing her job.
She looks absolutely miserable. Labour MPs, they can point as much as they like. The fact is, Labour MPs are going on the record saying that the Chancellor is toast. And the reality is that she is a human shield for his incompetence. In January, he said that she would be in post till the next election. Will she really?
The Prime Minister dodged the question and said the Tory leader was unlikely to keep her job.
She certainly won't. Mr. Speaker, I have to say I'm always cheered up when she asks me questions or responds to a statement, because she always makes a complete mess of it and shows just how unserious and irrelevant they are.
The former head of the Royal Navy, Sir Ben Kyiv, has been sacked. An investigation found his behaviour fell far short of the values and standards expected. The MOD says it's resulted in the termination of his service and his commission. He says he deeply regrets his conduct in the spring of last year. MPs have voted by a large majority to ban Palestine action. The measure applies under the Terrorism Act, and support for it will now be illegal. Members of the group broke into RAF Bryce Norton last month and sprayed red paint onto jet engines. The rapper Sean Diddy Coombs has been found guilty of transporting people for prostitution after a high-profile trial, but he's been cleared of the more serious charges he faced. Times Radio's Deputy Head of News, Alex Dibble, has more details.
He's now facing up to 10 years in prison, but if he'd been convicted of trafficking women for sex or racketeering, he'd have been facing up to life in prison. The jury in New York heard how he used his fame and his power to arrange drug-fueled sex sessions involving his own girlfriends and male sex workers.
The Crown Prosecution Service is considering further criminal charges in relation to deaths at hospitals where Lucy Letby worked. The 35-year-old former nurse is serving a whole life tariff in jail for murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 others between 2015 and 2016. And the British and Irish Lions scored 8 tries as they recorded another big win, this time over the Queensland Reds as they build up to the Australia Test Series. They thrashed the Brisbane-based side 52-12. Jack Morgan, who scored in the second half, was named player of the match. Captain Maro Itoje says they're going along nicely ahead of the first test in 2.5 weeks.
You learn more in games. It's probably a bit of a blessing in disguise that we have so many games in quick succession. You know, as a team today, we just wanted to be better. That was the mantra, just be better. And I thought we were a little bit better today.
And don't forget, you can set the Times News Briefing as your news service on Alexa.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker.
Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio with Barclays Business Banking.
It's good to have you with us on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company, which tonight is Henry Hill, the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. Hello, Henry, good to see you.
Hello.
And Mikey Smith is back with us, Political Editor at the Sunday Mirror. Hello to you, Mikey.
Hello.
I'm going to ask you first. We're going to be talking about welfare reform. We're going to be talking about the scene in the House earlier on, that show of emotion by the Chancellor, which absolutely inevitably has got everyone's attention. It means you've been looking at this situation. But firstly, just tell me your thought for the day, Henry.
Well, I mean, it's sort of the thought I'm having every day at the minute, which is just curious as to how much we can compress the traditional life cycle of a government. Because, we're at the point now where we're a year in, you had a huge historic majority, and now we're already at the point where we're thinking and talking about this government a bit of the way we talked about Rishi Sunak's, right? They can't deliver its legislation. Is the Chancellor going to stay or go, and all the rest of it? And, there's no real way necessarily that either party has a plan for making things better. So I'm just wondering, how compressed can we get this? From landslide victory to it's all over, like a matter of months. Like it's going to be. So that seems to be the scientific test that Britain is conducting on behalf of the democratic world.
Yeah, that's so. I mean, with the sort of caveat that the situation is almost unique. The situation that was inherited, the mood of the country, which instantly moved from despising the incumbent before the election to despising the incumbent after the election. And then we have the welfare crisis, and it is a crisis. I don't think you can dispute that word. And anyone and everyone, I think, is entitled to say the government has handled this badly, except the opposition, who are not in a position to be able to do that. And would you dispute that?
Well, I think they can say that the government handled it badly. This is one of the things they can do, right? I mean, the problem the Conservatives have is that obviously when you're so close to having been in office, then if you propose actual policy solutions, then people can go, well, why didn't you do this? But simply pointing out that the government is handling something badly in the moment is actually one of the few comforts afforded to this opposition.
Again, that's a point.
This point in the cycle.
Because I can say the government handled it really, really dreadfully badly because they did. And I've got no hesitation in saying that. If you ask me then, what are you going to do about welfare reform? That I start to stumble a little bit.
Well, I think this is, the interesting challenge for the Conservatives is that Kemi Badenoch has been quite explicit about, we're going to have a really long, slow policy process. And one of the big problems with that from the beginning is that government still happens and you need things to say when government is happening. So we already had her have to lift a policy on indefinite leave to remain in order to have something to say at the second reading of the Border Security Bill. And now it's fine for the Tories to say, Labour are fiscally responsible, they're going to be putting taxes up because they can't cut welfare. But it does invite the question, well, what would your welfare cuts be? And that means that maybe that's a bit of the policy review that should maybe be hothoused at this point if you're in CCHQ.
Yep. Now, Mikey, what's your thought for the day?
My thought for the day is entirely different. And it is, in fact, the reason I wasn't here last week, which is that I spent a few lovely days in Gibraltar. Had a lovely break, ate some lovely food, sat in the sunshine. A lovely time was had. But when you read about Gibraltar before you go to Gibraltar, what you read everywhere is, it's just like England. It's just like being in England. Yeah. You may as well be in, you look around, you think, I could be in Kent. So what I was thinking pretty much the whole time I was there is I was looking around and thinking, I could be in Spain because it's Spain. It's basically Spain. It's Spain with Belisha beacons. And if we're not going to give it back, which I guess we're not, we should really acknowledge that it's not a slice.
Back?
It's Spain.
I don't think the Kingdom of Spain existed when the Treaty of Utrecht was signed.
I should point out at this point that my views are my own and not necessarily reflected by any of my employees.
And you didn't share that view too loudly over your nice cold lager in the Dog and Duck.
No, I definitely did not. Right. But yeah, no, it was nothing like being in England. It was hot. The sea was clear and warmish. It was a lovely place to be. But
97% of its inhabitants want to be part of British rather than Spanish.
I saw that number, but wasn't that referendum taken about 30 years ago?
It was relatively recent polling, but also they haven't had huge freedom of movement or anything since then because there's a tiny rock.
Yeah,
right.
Well. I'm not against us owning a bit of Spain, but we should probably just acknowledge that for some reason we own a bit of Spain.
When Spain acknowledged that Ceuta Melilla are Moroccan.
Okay, you're listening to the Gibraltar debate on Times Radio. which will be going on only for the next 4 or 5 hours. But I may just cut it a bit shorter than that and just talk about welfare reform and what happened in the House earlier on, Mikey and Henry. The scene of the Chancellor tearing up in the Commons in the way that she did. Treasury say, look, talking about that, it's a personal matter, absolutely entitled to say that. It was also politically undeniably unfortunate, wasn't it, Mikey?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it moved markets. You know, there were markets which dipped or changed because of that, which is an extraordinary thing to say, but it happened. And it's been one of those days. It kind of harks back to the old days of the Tories, where you hang around in corridors and wait to catch a little bit from someone, a little bit from someone else. And what I've sort of come out of the day with is, it seems like what set Rachel Reeves off, because when she sat down in PMQs, she looked upset and she looked like she'd been she'd had a rough day for a start, but she was particularly upset, and that seemed to get worse throughout PMQs. And what I've been told happened a few moments before she sat down is she had a bit of a set to with the Speaker, which harks back to a row that she had with the Speaker yesterday about some responses she gave in the chat. I think she rolled her eyes in the chamber. Yeah. Or the Speaker thought she had rolled her eyes at him, and he was a bit upset by this.
We can have a listen back to that, because that's now part of the roaming, wandering narrative about all of this. The Speaker yesterday asked the Chancellor to give shorter answers at Treasury questions.
And as a result of that, we are investing £300 billion more than the plans we inherited from the party opposite. But we're the only country where... Oh, all right, OK.
I've got to get through. Helen Morgan.
Thank you very much, Mrs.
So interrupted there. Now, the Speaker's office has said no comment to that. And it's now been suggested that was part of the background to the Chancellor feeling.
Yeah, and what we don't know is whether that is the whole of it, whether something had happened prior to that and this was a straw breaking a camel's back or whatever. It's probably been quite a rough day for everyone, a rough few days for everyone in the government. Tensions are, tempers are probably pretty high. Everyone's a little bit stressed out, and maybe this was something that caused a bigger reaction than it would have done normally. The result of it, obviously, is not ideal, but we're probably allowed to show a little bit of emotion, even if we are the Chancellor. I think it's notable because it's unusual. It doesn't happen a lot.
Look, I mean, there it is, all over at the very top of the news bulletins. The picture of the Chancellor in that state of distress, all over the top of the news. It's going to be all over the front pages. It is already, and it will be overnight. It's the last thing that the Chancellor would have wished to be seen in that way, and the background is against a party and a government and a Chancellor under enormous pressure. And it's true, Rachel Reeves is allowed to be under pressure and to feel it, and maybe also to show it. But this will be something she'll, and a lot of other people will look back on with a certain amount of distress.
Sure. I mean, it's one of those things that becomes part of the highlight reel, not low light reel of when things get compressed into the slideshow in history. This will be one of the things that appears, and we don't know why it happened fundamentally, and ultimately it's all just speculation. But the challenge is that it was already, after the moment the government started U-turning on the fiscal things. First of all, you had the winter fuel allowance, and then you had the welfare revolt. You're already in a position which is truly remarkable at this stage, as I was saying, at this stage in the cycle for government with this size majority, where it can't deliver its legislative programme, which is sort of the thing that defines being a government in the British system, and specifically couldn't deliver things which the Chancellor had promised in a spending review. And it was always a question of when the bond markets started to notice this, because that is a very precarious position to be in. Because the whole point of having the OBR, which Labour strengthened when it came into office, is that it reassures the bond markets about the government's fiscal planning. And if you suddenly can't deliver the things that you're promising in response to the OBR's measures, that's going to make the markets wary. And obviously then having your finance minister in tears behind you.
Let me just add to that, because after what happened, Question Time happened, there was a reaction in the market. So the pound dipped a bit. There was a bit of a ripple in the bond markets too. And people who know more about this than me, who I was speaking to on the show earlier on, were telling me that the concern in the bond markets, how you finally discern these things, I'm not quite sure, but they were telling me that there was concern that the Chancellor might be at risk of going, and that's what was alarming the bond markets and alarming the city. In other words, a vote of confidence in Rachel Reeves staying where she was, for fear, presumably, of something worse.
Yeah, to an extent, that is almost certainly true. I don't know if necessarily call it a vote of confidence. It's a very negative vote of confidence.
Yeah.
But yes, I
fear
think
of something worse.
Yeah, the challenge is that the government has been trying and struggling to reconcile the expectations of its backbenchers with the fiscal reality of the situation that it's in. And now the Chancellor has just, it's now quite clear that this government cannot deliver substantial spending reductions of any real sort, right? Which means that at some point the government's going to have to come back and do tax rises, probably a lot of tax rises, which are going to be also probably unpopular with Labour MPs with slender majorities in Tory-ish seats. So that, I think, is the worry. Yes, there is the worry that you will have the Chancellor jettisoned and some less reality-inclined Chancellor replace her. But there's also, I think, simply the feeling of like, how can this government over the next 4 years, given that it's already got a mutinous backbench, that how can it navigate the horrible fiscal situation this country is in?
I'm just staying with what's dominating the news this evening, and inevitably conversations like this one. One of our listeners texted earlier on saying, crying, weeping is not weakness. It's not the same thing as weakness. What do you make about that? It's a sign of pain and distress. I mean, it is of showing the pain that the Chancellor was feeling at that moment, the pressure that she's under. Labour MPs on the other side are not having fun either, and how many of them have not come on air and said, I didn't become a Labour MP for this, to cut welfare and to take away from people who need it for various reasons. And to them, this stuff is painful. And to oversee it all and do maybe stuff which these MPs hate to see being done is presumably painful to Rachel Reeves, who's also a Labour politician as well, however convinced she is of the rightness of what she is doing. In those circumstances, maybe showing your emotion is something which it can be tolerated. Leave aside perceptions and reality and the narrative and the big pictures at the top of the bulletins. What do you think?
Well, I mean, one, perceptions is entirely what the toleration question is about, because you're talking about weakness is perceived, I think.
No, but it is a perception. There's also a reality question.
Fine, but is your suggestion that she's weeping at having to make cuts, that it's simply so distressing?
No, I'm not.
Well, that was maybe what I was because what was your point?
No, my point.
It's not pleasant being Chancellor. Fine.
My point is not that either.
What was it?
The point is this: that if crying in that way was an outward show, an expression of the distress of being Rachel Reeves just at the moment, and having to face the opprobrium of so many of your colleagues, having to read in anything you read almost every morning that your time is numbered in your job. And then just nothing about this is pleasant, and doing things which you'd much, much, much rather not be doing to show that distress. Is that the same as being weak? I mean, I used an example earlier on for the sake of argument, which is that one of our greatest leaders in history, Winston Churchill, used to bawl his eyes out while taking tougher questions than this.
I don't think it's necessarily an inherent sign of weakness. I think that the inability to control yourself in a public setting is a worrying indicator. If you were in a business that were in a during the crash or something, and you came in and you found your chief financial officer like crying in the toilets, it wouldn't fill you with confidence about the future of that business, right? Because it is fundamentally perception based. No, having situations being stressful, absolutely, and I do think sometimes that we do forget that politicians are human beings. But I think that one of the things that you do expect leaders, not just in politics, but in pretty much any situation, is that they pull themselves together for certain things, right? When you're on the podium, when you're on the front bench for PMQs, which is a half-hour period of her week, right? And I think that is the thing that is potentially going to spook the markets. It's just, understandably, that she's under an enormous amount of pressure, but maybe that's actually what shows how much pressure she's under. And somebody who maintained their composure, maybe they'd be able to play chicken with the markets more, and they'd be under just as much stress. But fundamentally, and it is a matter of perception, I think. No, it's not weak to cry, right? It's completely fine and healthy to do that. But to lose, when you are a chancellor of a country which is as exposed to the bond markets as we are, which is having to tread a very fine line to keep the public finances in order, to be unable to maintain your composure in a public setting is a worrying sign.
Okay, I wanted to put that point to you, and so I did. What's your take on that question?
My other thought is, if this was, if at least the trigger of this was a fairly angry exchange with someone in the Commons, which is full, is a relatively public place, and you've left that exchange not on the best terms, perhaps. Yeah. I think we're assuming that the weeping was as a sign of despair or a sign of exhaustion or distress.
Yeah, because it plainly was.
When she sat down, if you watch it back, when she sits down, she just looks furious. She looks really angry, and I think people can sort of relate to that a little bit, because when you've had a stand-up row in public with someone, you're sort of amped up, and she's got to sit immediately down next to Keir Starmer and try and look composed when she's probably pretty tired, and that is there are very few places for that feeling to go, except in your expression, and she was trying to hold it together, and she couldn't, and we don't know what the cause of it is really, but I think there could be. I don't think she'll come out of this particularly badly in the eyes of the public necessarily, because I think people will have been in that situation where they've had a stand-up row at work and they have to sit down at their desk and make out like everything's normal, and everything's not normal. You've just had a stand-up row with a colleague.
I wonder if she'll get a bit more empathy from the other side, including some of the rebels are absolutely implacable, but some of those
so by the other side, you mean the Labour rebels? Just to be clear. I mean, you look. Maybe sometimes this interpersonal stuff can, especially for those kind of intra conflicts, they can have more of a difference than when you're formally in different teams and on another side of the chamber. And if you look at political history, sometimes I was recently, for unrelated reasons, reading about the SDP and the Liberals, and there were a couple of times there where the Liberals actually blew something up and then realised how broken their leaders were and all sort of meekly tried to fix it afterwards. So that can happen, but structurally, I think we can overplay all of this. Structurally, the government is in a position where it is going to have to either cut spending, which it now chronically can't do.
Yes.
And I think any sympathy that these Labour MPs have is not going to endure long enough for them to sign off on substantial spending cuts. So it's a bit moot.
No, the tax rises are coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is right. Anyway, look, I wanted to have that conversation because I think that's the conversation which is happening in a great many sitting rooms right now as we speak. Anyway, more with us, Henry, with Mikey here on Pienaar and Friends with Barclays Business Banking. Grow your business. Bank on Barclays.
Pienaar Friends on Times Radio with Barclays Business Banking. Grow your business. Bank on Barclays.
Now here on Pienaar Friends, we're going to be crossing the Atlantic after the news and looking at what's going on in the United States, because there's always plenty to talk about in what's going on in Washington, D.C. And tonight, I promise you, is no exception whatsoever. Right now, we're talking about the welfare reform being called a crisis. I call it a crisis. I'm not sure what else you can reasonably call it. But the Chancellor's position right now, can we, what do you think, put to bed the idea that Rachel Starmer's job is at risk? Because I argue it is not. Henry, disagree with me.
Over what time scale?
I mean, I can't imagine a good time to lose the Chancellor in the foreseeable future. And I think there won't be a good time for Keir Starmer to part company with the Chancellor in this, except in circumstances we can't even imagine now. So under this kind of pressure, at this time, with enormously difficult fiscal decisions to be taken, which are going to cause all sorts of upset in the Labour Party and more widely. And Keir Starmer absolutely joined at the hip with Rachel Reeves. The idea of her being jettisoned or even allowed to go easily, that would be absolutely for the birds.
I don't imagine that Sir Keir Starmer would force her out anytime soon. If nothing else, I think at this point Rachel Reeves is acting as a kind of sin eater. And that you want her to have to, if you've got a load of painful decisions to make and you're going to change your Chancellor at some point, you probably want your current Chancellor to make all of those decisions, and then you jettison them into do a pre-election pivot towards whatever sunlit uplands you've managed to hack your way to by that point. It's also, I think, there's the fundamental question of, and I don't know, I'm not completely au fait with the internal dynamic of Labour, but it's very often the case that once Prime Ministers start jettisoning their closest supporters to save their authority is gone anyway, and they are essentially just propped up. Theresa May in 2017 being the clear example, or Liz Truss when she got rid of Kwasi Kwarteng. They May stayed in office for a bit, but her project was over. So I think that is probably true. There might be an open question about how much, because the interesting thing about this is, especially when you read the interviews with Starmer, is how utterly immiserating he's finding the job. And so I think that if there was a risk, it would be more perhaps Reeves or Starmer like wanting to step down, perhaps, than Starmer forcing them out. I agree with you. I don't think that he's going to force her out anytime soon, but that she might go anyway. Or just hedging a little bit. We talk about unimaginable circumstances. I mean, have you seen this Parliament so far? We have a government with a majority, with a three-figure majority that can't pass legislation. Like 6 months from now, God knows where we could be. I wouldn't rule that out either. Although that was a generalisation. A government that can't pass legislation. We're talking about welfare reform, which to Labour is as close to the soul as you get. But it cannot deliver its primary legislative programme. I mean, it could maybe pass other bills, but the fact that it can't pass the bills it wants to pass is a quite substantial stage in the death of the government.
Comparison. Welfare reform in Labour, Europe, and the Conservative Party. Again, and when it comes to the question of Europe, you mentioned the word in a room full of Tories, what used to be the case before the argument ended in the massacre of one side and the victory of the other, that there would be a riot.
But that's true. Although I don't think in the Labour Party there is a committed let's hack welfare to the bone faction. Which maybe gives it a slightly different flavour to because the European debate.
We've got a government which is in the business of squeezing welfare because they have no choice.
Absolutely, but I think what made the Tory wars especially vicious is that both sides were true believers, right? And in this, you've got a government which doesn't. I don't think anyone thinks that this government wants to be cutting welfare, right? But it feels that it has to, and then you have Labour MPs for whom that's unacceptable. That's obviously a very deep division. But I think that mercifully for Labour, it is of a slightly different kind to the Tory wars over Europe.
My point was it's inescapably divisive. And Rachel Reeves, she ain't going anywhere.
I don't think she's going anywhere for the moment.
For the moment,
well, I mean, there are two types of people who predict the future: fools and charlatans. But I try not to be either. But I don't know. I agree. I think
pundits predict the future all the time.
Yes, I know. I think my remarks might have been slight. Never mind. I'm going to stop talking now in a room full of pundits. Listen, I don't think Rachel Reeves is going anywhere right now. I think you're right. I think she's eating an awful lot of sin. I think she's pretty embedded into the Starmer project as it stands, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite from number 10 to change course on the broader project, which is, trying to make big fixes to long-term problems.
This road, there's no escaping the track that they're on. It's going to get worse. I mean, as they agonise about what on earth to do about welfare, the pressure from some, a big chunk in the Labour side of the House, to why are we so stuck with this fiscal rule fetish? That's just going to get louder and louder and louder, and Rachel Reeves is going to stick as hard to her convictions that it's not a fetish, it's an absolutely inescapable requirement.
And this is probably where I sort of come down, is that between the fiscal rules and how the welfare bill ended up, there has been a series of political errors. I don't think necessarily that the policies have been bad policies, and I think if you'd done them in a different order, sold them with a different story, then we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Think back to when the welfare bill was first revealed. It seemed to me very clear that there was, at the core of it, a package of reforms that broadly the whole of the Labour Party and most of the public could probably get on board with quite easily. And then tacked on top of that was $5 billion in cuts to disability benefits, which didn't seem to fit with the story they were trying to tell with the rest of it. If they'd held back the $5 billion in cuts, just told the story first off, and then maybe brought those in further down the line, because let's not forget, at that point they had 4.5 years to do all of this. If they'd done it more slowly, if they'd done it in bits rather than trying to make the spreadsheet add up on day one, then they might be seeing a better time now.
Okay, well, we're gonna leave that one there for the moment. We're gonna be back talking about it. This is Pienaar Friends with Mikey Smith and Henry Hill. After the news, we're going to cross over to the US and talk about what's going on there. First, though, at 6:31, here's the news with Andy Hayes.
Across the UK, on DAB Digital Radio, on the Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
The Chancellor's spokesperson says Rachel Reeves was upset over a personal matter when she was seen crying during Prime Minister's questions. The Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, is said to have pulled her aside before PMQs, after which she was reportedly in tears. It follows the government's massive climb down on its welfare bill last night. Conservative MP Graham Stewart says he has little sympathy for the Chancellor.
It's sad to see Rachel Reeves crying, but the people that I feel really sorry for are those whose lives have been destroyed by our policies. It's the farmers, the students, first-time buyers, publicans, small business people, the elderly. They have real tears.
The former head of the Royal Navy, Sir Ben Kyiv, has been sacked. An investigation found his behaviour fell far short of the values and standards expected. The MOD says it's resulted in the termination of his service and his commission. He says he deeply regrets his conduct in the spring of last year. MPs have voted by a large majority to ban Palestine action. The measure applies under the Terrorism Act, and supports for it will now be illegal. Members of the group broke into RAF Bryce Norton last month and sprayed red paint onto jet engines. And Sean Diddy Coombs has been convicted of 2 prostitution-related offences following his trial in New York. But the rapper's been cleared of the more serious charges against him: sex trafficking and racketeering allegations. And don't forget, you can set the Times news briefing as your flash briefing on Alexa.
This is Times Radio.
I've had goose.
Wherever you are.
Pienaar Friends on Times Radio with Barclays Business Banking. Find out how Barclays can help to move your business forward. Search Barclays Business.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Henry Hill from Conservative Home and Mikey Smith from the Mirror. And here's Kate telling us about what goes on after 7. Hello, Kate.
Hiya, John. We'll do some in-depth analysis into what we saw in the House today. Those extraordinary scenes. Rachel Reeves, who has worked so long and hard at her image, really, making sure that she is an ironclad Chancellor. And for an ironclad Chancellor to break down in the way she did, no matter how, sad it is to watch and how unfortunate an incident it is a loss of composure. She'll be perhaps annoyed at herself as well, having spent so long, focusing on this image of hers. We'll be digging into that as much as we can, actually, seeking Lots of expert opinion across it. There is the matter, of course, of £5 billion to find from somewhere and the ramifications on the markets today. The pound dropping. It's now more costly for the UK to borrow as well. All that is as a result of the speculation surrounding Rachel Reeves. The Times even has the runners and riders to replace her should the position become available. So we do need to talk about that. We'll discuss that with Michael Jacobs, former special advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and we'll continue to dissect it with Max Wilson, former head of campaigns for the Parliamentary Labour Party's Political Services Unit. Adam Bolton is with us as well. So plenty on this, and I just want to stretch it out and take a look at every angle of it. We'll be talking about that Gaza ceasefire. The leader of the Palestinian National Initiative Party, Mustafa Barghouti, will join us to tell us what he expects. I was listening to a member of the Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister's Likud party earlier, saying that he felt that this was it, that this was genuine, and that this proposed 60-day ceasefire would lead to peace. So we'll dig into that on the show as well today. Edward Lucas actually joins us a bit later. He's just written a piece that's just gone up on the Times website about how we should be looking at Georgia after its pretty much fixed elections last year. There are now not just shades but complete overtones of Russia running throughout Georgia, a clampdown on any kind of opposition to the party there, and Edward Lucas has done a deep dive into that. And the Bank of England is set to launch a consultation on its banknotes. They wonder whether the public wants some more diverse figures on there. A reminder that Jane Austen, Winston Churchill, JMW Turner are on the notes. But how do you feel about Stonehenge, oak trees being on our banknotes instead, John? Or would you prefer figures?
To be honest, if I told you I had strong feelings on the subject, I would be lying. It had never occurred to Stonehenge, pictures of Stonehenge. What are the stones?
Yeah.
Well, that wouldn't fall under the heading of diversity, would it, or would it?
Well, just different things
Animal,
to
vegetable,
people.
and mineral.
Oh, I see. Variety.
Variety. There was a whole lot of fuss when Jane Austen appeared. Do you remember the banknotes were very male-heavy for a while? But we'll be taking a little look at that. Is that just completely unnecessary? Do we even notice what's on our money anymore? Do we even carry any cash to notice in the first place?
I haven't seen a banknote in years.
Maybe it's time to do something wacky then. I mean, they're all waterproof now. Yeah. That was a big advancement, wasn't it? Yeah. Why don't we do something else with them? Make them holographic, available to do magical tricks? Well, we can do that already.
I love it. What's your view on this?
I think we should think about mixing up our banknotes a bit. They do feel very, very traditional. Maybe that's the point of them. Maybe we should do something inventive with them. Brain games to stop us getting senile in our old age. How about that?
Interactive.
Have you got a view on this, Henry?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's just a slight dreariness of the consultation. They could just do it, right? I mean, and no one would really notice.
Oh, but there'd be but
the idea that they're just idly curious whether or not there is a burning desire on the part of the public to have a slightly different composition of people on the banknotes is just slightly ridiculous.
Yeah. If you walk down the street and ask people, the first 10 people you bump into, what's on a £10?
The coins, on the other hand, the Royal Mint's absolutely outrageous, not putting Charles's name in Latin on the coins. Yeah, that's a serious problem.
Well, there we go. And also, should you have to be dead to be on the banknote?
That's another good question.
That's a good, sensible rule.
Oh, well, okay, all right. So you must be dead before you can feature.
Otherwise, just ends up.
You have to go some to earn being on a banknote if you're alive.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. You'd be, well, even though all of us have admitted to not really knowing or noticing what's on the banknotes, you'd have to go some, wouldn't you? Because you would be one of the most
the most frequently seen and most ignored faces in currency.
Raise some revenue, sell sponsorship slots.
Oh my gosh, sponsored banknotes.
Sponsor of the £5 note.
Well, that's now we're getting Trumpian.
Now you've broken the system.
There we go.
All right. And look forward to that, Kate. See you with us at 7 o'clock. So let's hop stateside and say hi to Julia. Julia Manchester, back with us, national political reporter at The Hill. Hello to you, Julia.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me.
Always welcome. Julia, so look, what should we talk about first? What about the news we've been discussing on air today? The announcement from the administration, the Trump administration, out of the Department of Defense, that arms supplies to Ukraine had been halted, had been paused, including missiles vital to air defence. Now, when I say it came out of the blue, it seems to be so, because I spoke a little bit earlier on to the chair of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee, that's Alexander Mereshko, and he said this.
We have official statement by our Ministry of Defense, which says that we need official confirmation of our American counterparts, and our Ministry of Defense is trying to get in touch with the Pentagon to confirm and to settle this issue. At the same time, today, the representative of the United States American Embassy, Chargé d'Affaires, was invited to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
It sounds, though, Alexander, from what you're saying there, that the government of Ukraine had no warning that the supply of weapons was going to be stopped or paused in this way.
Well, officially, there was no warning, of course, and there was no confirmation about that. It's, of course, disturbing for us.
So the announcement was made, signed off by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary for Defence in the administration, and it came out of the blue to the Ukrainian government. How's this going down there, Julia? It is a story. I've seen it being played on some of the networks.
Look, it's a little interesting. I guess it's an interesting development because last week at the NATO summit, President Trump was talking about these Patriot missiles and trying to find them for Ukraine. So this seems like a bit of an about face, but the White House is essentially saying this is just sort of about the current American stockpile and what Americans are able to provide. But, I think at the end of the day, this is, sort of Ukraine's worst fears or some of their worst fears about their relationship with the United States coming true. I think there is a fear that the U.S. isn't necessarily prioritizing their defense needs, particularly during the second Trump administration. We've seen Trump sort of, I don't want to say take a full step back, but, he's been a bit more maybe cautious or not as enthusiastic in his support of Ukraine as President Biden was during that last administration. So it's something that I think the Ukrainians are obviously trying to get used to. I think it was during the G7 earlier this month, not that this is directly related, but President Trump rushed back from that summit, sort of leaving Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky high and dry there when Zelensky was trying to get time with Trump. And we all know that there obviously is this big divide in the Republican Party over isolationism or this America First agenda. There are a lot of defense hawks within the Republican Party. I would say Secretary of State Marco Rubio is one of them who want to push back against Russian influence by any means necessary. But there's others within the party who say we need to literally put America first and take care of our issues here at home and not be this, as big of a global presence, if you will. So certainly, if you're Ukrainian, very concerning right now.
What do you think about this, Mikey and Henry? After the NATO summit, there was yet again another flurry of talk that maybe Trump was warming to the idea of getting tough with Putin. I mean, that he had, again, to use that, become a cliche, losing patience with Vladimir Putin. And then he was talking about maybe sending Patriot missiles to Ukraine. And I spoke to a number of people, including General Philip Breedlove, a former Supreme Commander in Europe of NATO, and he was arguing, look, it looks as if Putin's overplayed his hand. He's been tagging the president along for far too long, and Trump's had enough of it. And then this, a sudden announcement out of the blue, they're going to pause the supply of weapons. As I say, out of the blue. It is, certainly for Ukraine, bitterly disappointing, and on the face of it, another about face.
It is. Although the announcement has come out of the blue, this has been a clock that's been ticking under American and Western policy for some time, which is simply the fact that because we tend to have especially America, has very expensively developed weapon systems, and they have a very long tail and a very expensive tail when it comes to getting them and producing them and manufacturing them. Therefore, America has finite stocks of these weapons. And there has always been a concern, and we've seen this actually several times, even under the Biden administration, there was a huge back and forth about whether or not to send ATACMS, and do not ask me what that abbreviation stands for, but they were meant to be a game-changing weapon. And the problem is that America only has so much ammunition for any of these weapons, and there was a debate within the American defense establishment about what minimum level, given that America, much more than us, has global defense commitments, what minimum level do we need to keep in American arsenals? And so the sheer suddenness of this is perhaps a surprise.
Yeah, but that was also, when it came to the those longer-range missiles, the ATACMS. That was also about an American concern, Biden's concern, about those weapons being used to strike into Russian territory, which was a kind of escalation which he definitely didn't want to see. And we've seen, the complexion of American reservations have changed significantly since then.
They have, but ultimately the challenge with the war going on this long is it's become an attritional conflict. And Russia spends 7% of GDP on defence. That money goes an awful lot further because it is much cheaper in Russia, and they have much lower standards for things like workplace welfare and everything else. And they're developing lots of very cheap weapons. Glide bombs are literally just old 1980s munitions that they've stuck some wings on. They're buying drones that have been manufactured by Iran. And when we send in very expensive Western systems, they can often knock stuff out, but you're not trading at a good enough rate to turn the tide of the war. And the problem from the Western perspective is you can throw potentially your entire arsenal of advanced weaponry into this war, but without the ability to deliver change on the ground, and this is where the failure of the Ukrainian offensive in 23, I think, comes into it. Without the ability to change the facts on the ground, the question is they're not going to necessarily achieve anything because Russia simply has too much cheap equipment to be knocked out by this stuff.
Yeah, Russia now, in very recent weeks, they've upped the volume of air attacks and drones and missiles that have been fired into Ukraine. Just the last few weeks has seen the equivalent of many months previously that by way of a Russian air attack. So this is distressing to Ukraine, Mikey.
Well, I think there's another aspect to this, which, from what I gather, a lot of the push towards halting these shipments has come from the Department of Defence rather than from the White House. They've been sort of reassessing their stockpile, as you say, and found it lacking and are starting to get a little bit concerned about it.
Would the Pentagon be doing this without the White House being in the loop completely?
Which is the second point, which is that these munitions were promised to Ukraine by Joe Biden. This is how far back this goes. And Trump has been systematically unpicking everything Biden did over the last 6 months. And I think if someone at the Pentagon went to him and said, hey, Biden promised all of these things, you don't really want to do that, do you? I don't think he would have had much to think about there. I think he would have said no, fine, and maybe down the line we talk about sending different munitions that have come from me and not from Biden.
The president just seems to be so disinclined to turning the screw on Russia anyway. I mean, talking endlessly about upping sanctions and not doing it, always saying, I'll make my mind up in 2 weeks' time. Yeah,
I mean, he says 2 weeks' time about everything. And I spend a lot of time listening to Donald Trump talking on television in the Oval Office. And one thing that's come up over the last couple of weeks is that he's very, very happy that Vladimir Putin has been saying so many nice things about him. Because he has.
All right, so that's Mikey Smith. Henry Hill's here from Conservative Home, and we have from the Hill in Washington, Julia, Manchester. We're going to be talking in a moment about Gaza because there's been movement on that front from the President today. Get your thoughts on all of that here on Pienaar Friends with Barclays Business Banking. Find out how Barclays can help move your business forward. Search Barclays Business.
Is politics, business and sport every morning from 6 on Times Radio Breakfast. Today's another
And Henry Hill from Conservative Home, Mikey Smith from the Mirror, and Julia Manchester from the Hill in Washington on the line there from DC. Let's talk about, well, just briefly on this, Julia, because we've now heard, haven't we, President Trump talking about some sort of deal in Gaza, some sort of ceasefire. Look, I spoke about this earlier on to Aaron David Miller. He's a former Middle East negotiator at the State Department. He was not confident, let me tell you, that this discussed ceasefire would lead to a final deal.
One issue that's impossible to resolve is Hamas's demands that in return for releasing all the hostages, remember what we're talking about. We're talking about 20 perhaps living hostages. Hamas will not release them all until it gets ironclad assurances from the Americans that the war will end and Israeli military troops will be redeployed from Gaza. That's not going to happen.
Right, so maybe a ceasefire doesn't mean anything like a longer-term peace. Julia Manchester, how is this being discussed in D.C.?
It's a little unclear, and I think there's a lot of questions. I mean, President Trump said in a Truth Social post earlier today, essentially saying that, Israel has accepted terms, but he seemingly pressured Hamas in that same post to accept terms. So obviously, if Hamas doesn't accept the terms, there is I would assume there's no ceasefire there. I think for President Trump right now, especially coming off of those Iranian nuclear strikes just last month, this is something President Trump would want. I think, even though there are questions about how successful those strikes were on those nuclear facilities, it was a pretty incredible feat for the administration to pull that off and, carry out that mission, even though there's questions as to how far the nuclear program was set back. But, if he's able to somehow theoretically get a ceasefire, that would be two pretty big wins or potentially big wins in the Middle East that President Trump can tout. We know that he spent a lot of his administration, or second administration, I should say, talking about wanting to achieve peace in the Middle East, get the hostages back, etc. But I think right now we just don't have enough information. And, if only one party's agreeing so far, it's not a ceasefire. Yeah,
well, they're going to be meeting, supposedly, in about a week's time or less in the White House. Bibi Netanyahu, who wants to get a mark of presidential approval. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is essentially, as the person that was just being interviewed says, the challenge with the ceasefire has always been fine, but what follows the ceasefire? And you have a situation where the Israeli government, certainly the current Israeli government, is not prepared to allow Gaza to return to being governed by Hamas, which is what would happen if it withdrew. Hamas is understandably unwilling to accept terms which would involve the dissolution of Hamas and its expulsion from Gaza. And so there's no basis for peace negotiations. Effectively, they have two completely incompatible war objectives. And that's been the problem right from the beginning. From 6 months in, 3 months in, the first time people were talking about a ceasefire, and the question has always been fine, but a ceasefire has to be followed by negotiated terms, and there's no obvious sign of what those terms would be, and nothing about that has changed.
No, that is Mikey.
No, it seems like a very odd sequence of events. As Julie was saying, this has been agreed to by Israel, but it seemed like it hadn't been put in front of Hamas until Trump put it on Truth Social. And if the idea of putting it on Truth Social to pressure Hamas into signing up to it, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, you possibly think that what Hamas are really afraid of is bad publicity, and I'm not sure that's the case.
Yeah. All right, we'll be watching that meeting between the Israeli leader and the president when that happens at the White House. It will be fascinating, and we will be no doubt following it live, probably on this show, probably about now, in a few days' time. Now, look, before we close for the day, because time is really running out, I want to finish on something lighter. I think you can call this lighter, and we're doing it because this is another one of those things which, to American eyes, is becoming very, very familiar, but to eyes over here, certainly my eyes, it's incredibly, incredibly not normal. The president is back behind his counter again, flogging Trump stuff. The latest stuff is Trump cologne and Trump fragrances, which come in a Trump bottle with a little statue of Trump in the wrapping, and it comes with appropriate marketing, ads like this.
My new Trump fragrances are here. They make a great Christmas present. I've named them Fight, Fight, Fight because they represent winning. We all want to be winning. We have to win as a nation. We want to win as a family. This fragrance is all about strength and success and confidence for men and for women. Get yourself a bottle and don't forget to grab one for your loved ones too. They'll thank you and they'll even smell good. Enjoy, have fun, keep on winning, and Merry Christmas.
And that was the President of the United States flogging his Trump fragrances. Julia Manchester in D.C. with The Hill. Is this completely normal to you now, Julia?
You know, I have to say it's not surprising. It's still, I guess, weird to look at seeing the President of the United States rolling out all of these, products and brand names. You have Trump Bibles, Trump sneakers, Trump. I think there's an iPhone, not an iPhone, but a Trump phone or cellular service that is supposed to come out that Donald Trump Jr. was touting. But look, Donald Trump in the American psyche, he goes much more back than just, being president. He's been very much a fixture in pop culture, New York society. He's been in movies. The Apprentice was such a huge reality show here in the U.S. in the early 2000s. So I think Americans are used to the Trump name, but he's continued to capitalize on it. And during his first administration, starting in 2017, there was the Trump Hotel that was here in Washington, D.C. in the old postal building downtown. It's no longer there. It's now Waldorf Astoria. But at the time, there were so many investigations into Trump essentially slapping his name on that building and, him using, being accused of using the presidency to promote a lot of these products. It seemed like there was much more attention to that trend back during the first administration from his critics and Democrats. But now, oftentimes when you talk to people about this, they sort of roll their eyes. Yeah,
I mean, it's normal. And I was hearing earlier on that to a lot of Americans, I say, look, this is up front. You can see what he's up to. I mean, everyone's in it for what they can get, and you can see through this transparently clearly. However, I don't know. I refuse to treat this as normal.
I mean, it's basically sort of Japanese state Shintoism from the war, but without the dignity. Right? You're just waiting for the bit where you have a little shrine in your house and you light a little candle when you want Donald Trump to do something nice for you. It's baffling. And the problem is in America that you do end up, and this is the problem with public cynicism, and is that you get allegations, for example, that politicians, I think there was specifically Nancy Pelosi, alleged to have insider traded, right? And so you get people like, well, if they're going to make money that way, at least he is just selling sneakers or a Bible. I didn't know that you did private Bibles, but anyway. So you can see, I think it's awful. Right? It's weird. And like everything with Trump, that was just a fever dream of an advert. It even smells good for a cologne advert. It's just, but it's a, you can, whilst it is weird, I think it's an artifact of the fact that public standards have got so low because they're already so cynical about their politicians.
Yeah.
I wrote such a long article about this perfume yesterday.
Did you? So, forgive me, I missed that.
What are the base notes?
Give us the essence.
I haven't smelt it, but I can only assume it's, you too can smell like Donald Trump. It costs $249. That's £181. But if you buy two...
Sounds like a snip.
If you buy two, you get $100 off.
Is there a tariff on it?
There is not, as far as I know, a tariff on it. No, the money goes into some opaque web of shell corporations based in Wyoming. It's a fascinating rabbit hole to delve down.
Yeah, Julia Manchester at The Hill. Should we put that down as your Christmas present, Julia?
Oh my gosh! I see Trump advertisements all the time. Maybe be a little more creative. I've had enough Donald Trump.
Elegantly answered, and we're going to leave it there. Guys, thanks for coming in, Henry and Mikey. Thank you for listening. Our producer was Ollie Cole, technical operator Isaac Marley. Kate's up next, and welcome and stay with Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB Digital Radio, on the Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker. Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have a great night. It is 7 o'clock. It is the evening edition.